Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet. Welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. We are now on part 5 of our series on the heresy of theological liberalism. And we've covered all the details of the heresy itself. So now we're going to move on to the Church's historic response to the heresy. And it's going to be a little bit different this time than we have with the other ones, because this time we're still living in it. There's no way I can just say, oh, hey, this was finally resolved at the Council of such and such on such and such a date. Or, this church father wrote the definitive work on the subject. I can't do that for this issue because, dead or not, we are still dealing with the fallout from theological liberalism even today. And I think part of that is because, in large part, the church's response has been to run away instead of really dealing with it. Oh, are you having problems with the Prussian Union and they're forcing you to do communion a way that you don't like because they want to be all ecumenical and such? Well, just go to America. There you go. That'll solve the problems. Oh, are you having problems in academia with your professors being heretics? Well, let's just dispense with rigorous academic study altogether. That's kind of where you get fundamentalism out of, right? And to be fair, that is an easy mistake to make. If all your schools are being run by heretics, it's not completely unreasonable to look at schooling in a fairly negative light. But at the same time, God does tell us to love him with all our minds. And at the same time, Christians have been giving rigorous thought to Christianity throughout the history of the church. It's not something we should just abandon. I can understand the temptation, but not a good solution there. Or, hey, are you having problems with your denomination and the theological liberals are taking over? Well, split your denomination in two. And then you have the liberal version and the other version. And again, these types of things, these aren't always bad things, right? Because the practical reality is that parents do have a responsibility to raise their children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And if they can't do that in their current church or with their current school system, then so be it. Yeah, you have a responsibility to make a new church or a new school system. It's what you've got to do. At least to find a new church. I don't mean make a new church. Find a new congregation at the very least, or plant a new congregation. Sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. But unfortunately, that has been the larger trend over the past 200 years. And we've been retreating, and we've been retreating, and we've been retreating. And unfortunately, we've kind of run out of places to run to at this point. There's no new world anymore where you can start a new nation which has different ideas on religious freedom, right? And while you did have a handful of apologists and theologians and philosophers who did defend Christianity during the Enlightenment, but it was never really fashionable, or at least not defending orthodoxy was never really fashionable, even in churches, because kind of a perfect storm situation here at the time. Most of our churches were more focused on piety rather than doctrine. How do we be good people? What methods do we follow in order to become more pious Christians? As for doctrine, we'll just take that for granted. And of course, whatever you take for granted, that's the sort of thing you lose. So, as we talked about how... the response to theological liberalism, apologetics, actually defending it didn't really get much traction until well into the 20th century, which was a lot later than it should have been. And we talked about how theological liberalism developed, and you might have noticed when we did that at every step of the way, every single step was based on philosophical assumptions primarily, not on actual investigation. And you also might have noticed that their attitude, the liberal attitude, was that every assumption they made was actually the result of their highly advanced reason and intellect being applied to the evidence. But eventually, people began noticing that the game was being played, and they openly started to question it. And there are a lot of people we could talk about here. But I'm going to focus on two, and as, I guess, symbolic of certain important trends in our response to theological liberalism. And the first person I'm going to talk to is, in my opinion, the prime example of the philosophical response to theological liberalism, and that is C.S. Lewis. Lewis was born in 1898, died in 1963, interestingly enough, on the same day as JFK and of Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World. So, yeah, he was born in Ireland, grew up in the Anglican Church, but he did leave the faith during his adolescence, in many respects due to the problem of evil. He was, in a lot of ways, the stereotypical atheist who was really, really angry at God for not existing. And so he went on, and he became an academic, right? He studied literature and mythology, and he ended up teaching in the English departments at Oxford and Cambridge. He was friends with J.R.R. Tolkien, who played a role in his return to the faith, although Tolkien was disappointed that Lewis did not become Catholic at the end. And he ended up being a prolific author. He wrote all sorts of fiction, all sorts of nonfiction. I have a huge stack of his books, but I don't even have half of them. Certainly don't own all of them. And in many respects, Lewis is considered the foremost apologist of the 20th century. And what Lewis ended up doing was pointing out that the modernistic preconceptions were being forced on the study of history and of religion, and kind of as we've been talking about this whole time in this series. And many of their conclusions, they weren't actually the result of reason or evidence, but they were the result of trends and evidence. And being an academic himself, he was well acquainted with how these things actually worked, and he was willing to expose it. And he did so while still maintaining his own intellectual and academic rigor. He didn't abandon his academic training. Instead, he used it and he put it into God's service instead of serving the spirit of the age with it. And he exposed a lot of the philosophical assumptions. He questioned their validity. And most importantly, he reframed so many of the conversations so that it became possible for Christians to communicate on an intellectual level about their faith. So yeah, prolific author, addressed a lot of different subjects, I can't go through all of these, so we're just going to do a brief survey of some of what I consider to be the most important ones. And the first one that you have to point out, and this is really a direct response to theological liberalism, is Lewis's famous trilemma. Because the liberal view was that Jesus was a great human teacher, that he had these great God experiences that opened people's minds and led them to think more about the divine, just like all those other religious teachers. And then they figured that all this talk of him performing miracles and being God was just a bunch of stuff that his overzealous followers projected onto the stories, sometimes centuries or more after his death. But they did want to hang on to his ethics and some of his teaching, so, they like forgiveness, or at least forgiveness in the sense of leniency. They like caring for the poor and a lot of things Jesus talked about. So they just need to cut out all that miraculous nonsense and make Jesus just a great human teacher. But Lewis rightly observed that if you have Jesus minus miracles, you do not end up with a great teacher. Because Jesus doesn't just claim to be God in the Gospels, he also consistently behaves as though he were God. Remember Athanasius, when we talked about the Arians and all those lines of argument he took from Scripture to show Jesus' divinity. He forgave sins. He called himself the way, the truth, and the life. He gave himself titles reserved for Yahweh. He accepted worship from people. And then he called himself meek and lowly of heart. So, yeah, Jesus is a little bit too interesting of a character to really reduce him to just a great human teacher like everybody else. If he's not God, all these things that he was doing are absolutely absurd. They're ridiculous. And yet, even the critics who read the Gospels and think that those Gospels are absurd don't generally think that Jesus, per se, is absurd. They want to prop him up as this great human teacher. And that's where Lewis's trilemma comes in. This is in Mere Christianity. I'm just going to read a brief section there. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is one thing that we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who said he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. And that's really what it comes down to. If you want to say that Jesus is a great teacher, and you actually look at the things he taught, you have to accept the fact that this great teacher taught that he was himself God. If he's lying about that, he's not a great teacher. But if he is a great teacher, then he wasn't lying about that. Lewis also wrote a whole lot about the subject of miracles. And again, there's too much to really go all the way through, but I'm going to settle for a handful of some of the arguments here. And again, part of this was simply Lewis pointing out that the anti-supernaturalism that was rampant in academia was actually a philosophical presumption, not a result of scientific inquiry. And he did a lot to clarify the relationship between science and miracles. And while science has, disproven, some so-called miracles, like here's the, we saw the statue was, bleeding or whatever, but here we found out that it was just, rusty water or something, I don't know. So it could find alternative explanations for miracles in general, or in some specific instances. But Lewis did point out that science, being as it is, solely concerned as it is with describing nature, ultimately has nothing to say about supernature. If miracles are supernatural, science can't really prove or disprove those miracles. It can't say anything about it at all. It can only assume that subjects outside of its purview don't actually exist. That's logical positivism, right? Science is the only way you can know anything. It's the attitude a lot of people still carry today. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Science isn't really up to the task of evaluating miracles, at least not on its own. One of the examples he gave was with billiard balls. Right? If you hit a billiard ball at a certain angle with a certain amount of force on a certain surface, you can calculate where it's going to go and the reactions of all the other billiard balls to it. But what you can't do is calculate somebody reaching down onto the table and pulling the billiard bar up, picking the billiard ball up after it's been hit. Yeah, obviously that's going to change the way that it moves. And the person who picks up that billiard ball, he's not breaking the laws of physics, right? He's just superseding them through his own action. And if miracles exist, that's ultimately what God is doing. He's superseding those laws of nature. He's not breaking them. Nothing says that they're inviolable. It's just that there's more at work in these situations than just the laws of nature. Again, you could say that another example he gave, I think, was of putting coins in a dresser drawer. And he put in 5 coins at one point, and then he put 12 more coins in there later on. And of course, the laws of mathematics would say 5 plus 12 is 17. So there's got to be 17 coins in there. But if the thief comes in, takes some of the coins out of there, it's not going to be 17 anymore. And the thief isn't breaking the laws of mathematics. He's just breaking the laws of England, right? He's just violating those laws. He's stealing, but he's not breaking the laws of nature. Same thing with God when he's performing a miracle. He's adding something else to the mix. The other argument about miracles that's really important is the really arrogant presumption from theological liberals that the only reason ancient people believed in miracles was because they were these unsophisticated brutes who didn't understand the laws of nature, didn't understand science, so of course they were too stupid to know that miracles can't happen. We, however, we are advanced enough to understand and know that the laws of nature preclude miracles. I love Lewis's response to this. This is nonsense. When St. Joseph discovered that his bride was pregnant, he was minded to put her away. He knew enough about biology for that. Otherwise, he would not have regarded pregnancy as proof of infidelity. When he accepted the Christian explanation, he regarded it as a miracle precisely because he knew enough of the laws of nature to know that this was a suspension of them. Yeah, it's talk about, nobody in the age of science can believe in a virgin birth. It's like, what? 4,000 years ago, they didn't know how babies were made. 2,000 years ago, they didn't know how babies were made. Absolutely ridiculous. There's more going on in the situation than the laws of nature, not less. And certainly science does not prove that these didn't happen. And certainly people in the ancient world didn't just assume miraculous for things that were everyday cause and effect. So, talked a lot about miracles. Also did a lot to address higher criticism. And this is really solidly in his wheelhouse because his profession was in literature. That's where his specialty was. And so he did a lot to show that higher criticism, as it evaluated biblical literature, left a lot to be desired as a supposedly scientific methodology. And he addresses this in Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism, which it's a talk that he gave to a bunch of students of liberal theology at a seminary in defense of some statements that he had made to their principal. And again, back in that day, you object to the academic zeitgeist, they would actually invite you to come and give your talk, and then you discuss it. Nowadays, they just throw you off campus. But anyway, so he made a few different arguments about that. First, he noted that his critics don't actually understand literature. Trying to relegate the Gospel of John, for example, to poetry or allegory, it was being done by people who didn't even recognize those genres, let alone read them properly. To quote Lewis, "These men ask me to believe that they can read between the lines of the old texts. The evidence is their obvious inability to read in any sense worth discussing the lines themselves." The absurdity that the closest followers of Jesus completely misunderstood everything that he was teaching, and only modern scholars have been able to finally decipher them to discover, to everyone's surprise, that Jesus thought just like a modern scholar. He pointed out that ridiculousness. He pointed out the anti-supernaturalism in his presuppositions. And one of my favorites is he addresses from personal experience just how valuable or non-valuable, valueless the practice of discovering the origins behind the text really is. I'm going to read at length here from Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism. All this sort of criticism attempts to reconstruct the genesis of the texts it studies. What vanished documents each author used, when and where he wrote, with what purposes, under what influences, the whole sits in Laban of the text. This is done with immense erudition and great ingenuity. And at first glance, it is very convincing. I think I should be convinced by it myself, but that I carry about with me a charm, the herb moly, against it. You must excuse me if I now speak for a while of myself. The value of what I say depends on its being first-hand evidence. What forearms me against all these reconstructions is the fact that I have seen it all from the other end of the stick. I have watched reviewers reconstructing the genesis of my own books in just this way. Until you come to be reviewed yourself, you would never believe how little of an ordinary review is taken up by criticism in the strict sense, by evaluation, praise, or censure of the book actually written. Most of it is taken up with imaginary histories of the process by which you wrote it. The very terms which the reviewers use in praising or dispraising often imply such a history. They praise a passage as spontaneous, and censure another as labored. That is, they think they know that you wrote the one Currente Calomo and the other In Vita Minerva. Apologize for my pronunciation there, I don't do Latin. What the value of such reconstructions is, I learned very early in my career. I had published a book of essays, and the one into which I had put most of my heart, the one I really cared about and in which I discharged a keen enthusiasm, was on William Morris. And in almost the first review, I was told that this was obviously the only one in the book in which I had felt no interest. Now, don't mistake, the critic was, I now believe, quite right in thinking it was the worst essay in the book. At least everyone agreed with him. Where he was totally wrong was in his imaginary history of the causes which produced its dullness. Well, this made me prick up my ears, since I have watched with some care similar imaginary histories both of my own books and of books by friends whose real history I knew. Reviewers, both friendly and hostile, will dash you off such histories with great confidence, will tell you that what public events had directed the author's mind to this or that, what other authors had influenced them, what his overall intention was, what sort of audience he was principally addressed, why and when he did everything. Now I must first record my impression, then, distinct from it, what I can say with certainty. My impression is that in the whole of my experience, not one of these guesses has on any one point been right. That the method shows a record of 100% failure. You would expect that by mere chance they would hit it as often as they miss, but as I have not kept a careful record, my mere impression may be mistaken. What I think I can say with certainty is that they are usually wrong. And yet, they would often sound, if you didn't know the truth, extremely convincing. Many reviewers said that the ring in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was suggested by the atom bomb. And what could be more plausible? Here is a book published when everyone was preoccupied by that sinister invention. Here in the center of the book is a weapon which it seems madness to throw away, yet fatal to use. Yet in fact, the chronology of the book's composition makes the theory impossible. Only the other week, a reviewer said that a fairy tale by my friend Roger Lancelin Green was influenced by fairy tales of mine. And nothing could be more probable. I have an imaginary country with a beneficent lion in it. Green, one with a beneficent tiger. Green and I can be proved to read one another's works, to be indeed in various ways closely associated. The case for an affiliation is far stronger than many which we accept as conclusive when dead authors are concerned. But it's all untrue nonetheless. I know the genesis of that tiger and the lion, and they are quite independent. Now surely this ought to give us pause. The reconstruction of the history of a text when the text is ancient sounds very convincing. But one is, after all, sailing by dead reckoning. The results cannot be checked by fact. In order to decide how reliable the method is, what more could you ask than to be shown an instance where the same method is at work and we have facts to check it by? Well, that's what I've done. And we find that when this check is available, the results are either always or nearly always wrong. The assured results of modern scholarship as to the way in which an old book was written are assured, we may conclude, only because the men who knew the facts are dead and can't blow the gaff. Yeah, that's a fantastic point there. There's so much speculation. And if the speculation doesn't even hold up when people in the same culture, at the same time, who are still alive and can talk to one another, examine those works, what chance exactly do you have of reconstructing the text written 2,000 years ago in a different language, in a different culture? It's absurd. And Lewis was quite correct in pointing that out. And just to leave off a summary from that, one of the last lines of his from that talk, I do not wish to reduce the skeptical element in your minds. I'm only suggesting that it need not be reserved exclusively for the New Testament and the creeds. And that's the thing about skepticism, philosophical skepticism. If you want to be skeptical, fine, but you've got to apply that same skepticism to your skepticism itself. If you don't do that, if you're doing it so selectively, you're not really being skeptical. You're just being dragged along in a different tradition. And lastly, one of the key things that Lewis did here was to reintegrate experience with the intellect. Liberal theology was based on human religious experience, and it was based that way because you couldn't intellectually believe that there's anything outside of that experience, that there's no truth outside of that in the text itself. You had your own personal feelings, but those feelings don't really mean anything else to anybody but you. They're yours, and nobody's is really better than anybody else's. Lewis, however, reintroduced the idea of natural law. Human experience is that we all expect and we act as though there is a true set of rules, which all people must abide by and which all people know. That is basic human experience. And you can see it very plainly. Even you have a lot of people today who will say, oh, there's no such thing as morality for universal morality for everybody. But they'll still act as though it's true. Humans will depart from specific ethics, but they do not depart from morality in general. Even that person who says there's no such thing as right and wrong, he immediately turns around and says, so it's wrong of you to force your morality onto others. No, everybody, even people who don't believe in right and wrong, still act as though right and wrong exist. That is just an essential core of human experience. And in a variety of ways, the intellect in any meaningful sense of the word depends on that kind of natural law being real. Because if our thoughts are just electrical impulses resulting from blind chance and so forth, the best you can say about our minds is that they have a reproductive advantage. But what you can say is that our thoughts are capable of telling us the truth about reality. Those are two very, very different things. Far from being a substitute for anything outside, our humanity demands that we believe in something outside of ourselves. Natural law, hugely important. Now, if you haven't read The Abolition of Man by Lewis, read The Abolition of Man. So yeah, Lewis, hugely important when it came to dealing with the philosophical angle, addressing that angle of theological liberalism. But there is another angle to this, and that is the evidential response to the claims of theological liberalism, who said that science has disproved all this stuff. Nobody scientific can actually believe this actually happened. And since we started off this whole thing with a couple of very, very bad Lutherans, I do want to finish up here with a good Lutheran, and that is John Warwick Montgomery. And he's still alive. He was born in 1931, still teaching. And in a sense, he's kind of the anti-Schleiermacher. He grew up in theological liberalism, but he converted to Orthodox Christianity in college through the aid of an apologist in his dorm. And the guy's an absolute genius. He's got like 11 academic degrees in philosophy, law, history, theology. He's an ordained pastor. He's a lawyer who practices in multiple U.S. and some European countries. He's written over 235 books. Unfortunately, most of those seem to be out of print, so I haven't read that many of them. And he was very hugely influenced by C.S. Lewis. But whereas Lewis went more towards philosophy, Montgomery goes more towards evidence, because the Enlightenment assumed that science would eventually debunk all supernatural claims, and most elite intellectuals just went right along with that. But they skipped a step in that whole process, that minor, annoying step where you actually examine the evidence and see where it leads you apart from your prejudices. They never actually did that. They never actually examined it. They just said, oh, that's silly. Nobody can believe that. But they never evaluated it. It was all just presumption. And if you examine the historical evidence for Christianity, especially the resurrection, the same way that you would for anything else, then you would conclude that it's true. Christians and non-Christians, we live in the same world, we can observe the same facts, and sometimes we can draw the same conclusions based on those facts. Montgomery takes a whole lot of cues from his work as a lawyer, because his goal is not to prove Christianity beyond any doubt, which was a failing of a lot of the early responses to theological liberalism. His goal is to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, straight out of the courtroom. You lay out the evidence, you let people decide. And accordingly, it's a whole lot less about speculative philosophy and a whole lot more about hard evidence. You don't start with a philosophical proof of the existence of God. You start with historical evidence for Christ, and you conclude that he's God. Kind of a very Christocentric approach to apologetics. And you'll note also that Jesus really does the same thing in the Gospels. He presents evidence for his claims. When the Pharisees are all upset that he forgave somebody's sins, well, they say, well, what's easier, to say your sins are forgiven or take up your mat and walk? But so that you know that I have the authority to forgive sins, I say, I'm God. He tells paralytic man, take up your mat and walk, and he does. Very powerful evidence for his claims there. And that's the thing, if somebody has an alternate explanation for these facts, let him present his evidence for them. Let him present his arguments. And we'll see which explanation comes out on top. Christianity is a religion that is based on investigatable facts. It can be verified. It can be potentially falsified. But you have to actually look at the evidence. And it's a very brief overview of his evidence for Christ here. And this is by no means comprehensive. This is just a brief summary. First off, you have to start with the Gospels, accept the Gospels as valid evidence. And he knows that, they would satisfy the requirements for being admitted as evidence in a court of law. We do give a certain presumption of innocence to eyewitness testimony. In other words, if, say, Luke and John claim that they're writing historical accounts, you take their word for it until you have evidence that they're liars. Which is not to say that Christianity has no burden of proof in this regard, but it is to say that the higher criticism's rampant suspicion of the original documents is intellectually untenable. You can't just assume they're false and go from there. You accept them as evidence. And again, accepting that evidence does not immediately mean that they're accurate. But it does mean that they're admissible, that they can be evaluated. Their accuracy can be evaluated. And once you do that, once you actually evaluate the evidence, how accurate they are, you do find that they're historically reliable. They do claim to be speaking about history, not to be about storytelling. They explicitly claim this. They're written by people who were there, who would know. Matthew and John were disciples. Mark and Luke were companions to Peter and Paul, respectively. And Paul, even though he didn't follow Christ around during his life on earth, he was in contact with those who did. He was confirmed to be teaching the same thing they were, and he did see the risen Christ later on. You also notice that they don't actually come off as liars. They would know, and they don't act the way liars act. For one thing, they corroborate one another. Not by blindly repeating one another and listing exactly the same thing, but by telling the same story, each remembering slightly different but compatible details, which is exactly the thing that police look for when they're interviewing witnesses. If they all say exactly the same thing and all hit exactly the same points, it means they got their story straight first. But if they're all telling the same story in different ways with different details, they're probably just recounting their own experiences. They give accounts that include many different named witnesses. Witnesses that people back then could have actually asked, could have actually approached to verify what they said. Most of them died specifically because they refused to recant their stories. Which again, if they knew it was false, if they were just making it up, that's not something a whole lot of deliberate liars will do. People die for something that they believe to be true, not something that they know to be false. And lastly, they give all sorts of very specific details, and they're the kind of specific details that liars will try to avoid. Liars try to be vague. But in contrast, you go to the Gospel of John, and John talks about, oh yes, there was this paralyzed man in Jerusalem who had been lying for 38 years near the pool with 5 roofed colonnades called Bethesda that was near the sheep gate. Okay, yeah, that's not an anonymous person. Jerusalem is not so big of a place that if you lived there, you wouldn't know who he meant. I worked in downtown Chicago with my dad for a few summers, and I could say, oh yeah, I saw that beggar who dressed all in denim, who had the harmonica and the little dog that he's always really mean to, and he would know exactly who I meant, because even in a city as big as Chicago, you could do that. John's doing exactly the same thing there. And you find those kinds of details all throughout the Gospels. The kind of things that liars would avoid because they want to be vague so that nobody could check up. These are things that could have actually been verified by the people around. And what do these historically accurate Gospels tell us? Well, they all talk about the resurrection, that Jesus died and he rose again. And again, if you're looking at this from the perspective of evidence, you don't worry about how it could be possible for that to happen. You start out asking, well, did it actually happen? Speculative philosophical objections to miracles are irrelevant in the face of actual evidence. And making the case is actually pretty simple. For resurrection, you need to know that Jesus was dead at point A and that he was alive again at a later point B. That's it. Those are the two claims you have to provide evidence for. Carl Sagan, he'll talk about extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Again, philosophical presumption that is irrelevant, because claiming somebody's dead is not extraordinary. Neither is claiming that somebody is alive. Those are very, very ordinary claims, both of those. It's only in the synthesis of those two that it really becomes extraordinary. But the synthesis is merely a logical deduction from the two very, very ordinary claims. As far as Jesus' death, this one's a brute historical fact. It's attested to by all 4 Gospels, by Paul. It's attested to by secular historians like Josephus, Tacitus. It's even the Talmud. Every historical record that we have from the time agrees that Jesus died. And the eyewitness accounts of what actually happened to him all ensure that, yes, he was dead. There was a article in the Journal of the American Medical Association back in the 80s. They basically did an autopsy based on the details in the Gospels and concluded that, yeah, Jesus was absolutely dead from what he went through on the cross. And the second point, as far as Jesus being alive again, Yeah, there's a lot of evidence for that too. For one thing, he wasn't in the grave. We can be sure of that. Nobody produced the body. All sorts of witnesses saw the tomb empty. And you never had any opponents of Christianity, and there were plenty, pointing out that, oh no, the grave is right there, guys, to prove that, yeah, Jesus is still dead. That generally the tombs of important historical figures tend to attract a following. On the contrary, what you do find is that the Pharisees who wanted Jesus dead, they claimed that the disciples stole the body. In other words, even the people who had Jesus killed still believed in the empty tomb. This had a different explanation for why it was empty. But Jesus was seen alive. He was seen alive by a great many different people, most of whom had actually given up on him. If you look at the disciples' behavior after the crucifixion, they ran away. They thought he was the Messiah who would redeem Israel. Thomas famously, I'm not going to believe it until I put my hands in his side, right? Most of them had given up, but they actually saw him. They actually saw him eat and drink. He was seen in groups. Paul mentions he appeared to 500 people at once. People heard him, they touched him, and so forth. He was seen by skeptics as well as believers. And those are the facts that we have. Those are the evidences that we have, and the alternate and the resurrection is the best explanation for that, because the alternate explanations aren't nearly as good. They have to ignore more and more of the evidence. You talk about, oh, he swooned. Well, you're ignoring all the details of what was inflicted on him. You have to ignore that evidence. Oh, it's a hallucination. Well, you have to ignore how hallucinations work. Hallucinations are usually one sense, not multiple senses. There aren't a whole lot of group hallucinations. Hallucinations are the result of certain mental states, but the disciples were all in different mental states. Hallucinations is a really bad theory. It's just not how they work. And so forth. And when you consider an actual resurrection of Jesus as an explanation for the existence of the Christian church, for the eyewitness accounts, for the brute facts of history, it's the only one that adequately fits all those facts. It is the best explanation. Every other explanation I've seen has to ignore a whole lot of the evidence. And when closely examined, scenarios like swooming or they got the wrong tomb, they become a farce. They're miraculous in their own right, just without historical evidence supporting them. And so theological liberalism, they thought that to actually believe these things, a Christian would have to be either ignorant or stupid. But upon closer examination of the evidence, we find exactly the opposite. This is demonstrably not the case. They just assumed science disproved Christianity. They never actually did the hard work of carrying out that examination. And that is where we're going to pause for now. Next time, we are going to wrap up this series by briefly talking about the ways theological liberalism is being repackaged today.